Good morning and welcome. Thank you for tuning in for this conversation with Dr. Jessica Stern, research professor at Boston University. Jessica, it's really great to see you again. I'd like to ask you some questions and have a conversation for about 30 or 40 minutes about a variety of topics of interest to readers of terrorism and political violence. To begin with, given your academic background was in chemistry, chemical engineering, technology policy, and so forth, what inspired you to get involved in the study of terrorism? When did that come about?
I heard one lecture. I was doing my doctorate at Kennedy School, and Brian Jenkins came to Kennedy School and he gave a lecture, and that actually changed my life. I got completely fascinated by terrorism.
And he, of course, he shares a very similar interest as you in terms of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction.
Hmm.
I think one of his latest books was about, will terrorists go nuclear? Some of that regards. Your first book in 1989 was The Ultimate Terrorists. It was about the terrorism and weapons of mass destruction intersection. I was wondering if you had any difficulties convincing a publisher to produce a book on this topic.
No, I did start out as a scientist, and uh, I this was an obvious direction for me to go in. And I had written an op-ed, and a publisher came to me, actually.
Uh,
Harvard University Press, the editor came to me and asked me to write a book. So no, that was a very different era. But yes,
yeah, this
that's
is
how it
pre
happened.
9/11. It was before this whole flurry of publications on terrorism came about after 9/11. Yours predates that by a couple of years.
Right.
This book.
Yeah.
So, would
Yeah.
you recommend that new scholars and doctoral students spend some time investing in op-eds to try and get some attention for their ideas?
Today I think podcasts are also really, really important, but it is a very good way. It's also what's op-eds are good not only to attract attention to something that fascinates a young scholar, but also to practice communicating. I think being able to say something succinctly is a tremendous challenge and actually good training for writing a book, ironically.
It's been more than 25 years since that book was published, and we've not really seen too many examples of terrorists exhibiting interest or even capability regarding weapons of mass destruction. Some probably do have capacity to do so, like maybe Hezbollah, Hamas, some of the West African jihadist groups, and yet they don't. Why do you think weapons of mass destruction is such a rare phenomenon in the field of terrorism?
Well, as I argued in the book, chemical and weapons were much more likely than nuclear, radiological, the most likely nuclear type of weapon. And we do see terrorists accelerationists pretty obsessed with power plants, including nuclear power plants. Why have they not done it? Uh, Other things are easier. I think the what they want to achieve, getting attention to their purported cause, is easier in other ways. For example, uh, conventional power plants would be easier to take down than nuclear.
See, you worked in the White House back in the early 1990s, working on some high level national security policy making, decision making regarding the security of nuclear materials. Are you still concerned today about terrorists crossing that nuclear threshold someday?
I would say I'm still concerned about the same things. I mean, we were very worried about nuclear terrorism, low-level nuclear terrorism, because of the loose nukes problem. That was really a very concerning issue at that time. When the Soviet Union broke up, there was a lot of unprotected material, and the possibility of devices maybe ending up in the wrong hands, small devices. That was also a concern. But the main concern was the possibility that material could be sold to create a rudimentary device, or again, radioactive terrorism. That was much more concerning even then. And yes, I am concerned. I remain concerned about that.
Have the concerns evolved? Have they changed at all? Have elevated, decreased?
Since the war in Ukraine, Russia has been essentially threatening to use nuclear weapons. And I think using nuclear weapons or attacking a nuclear power plant is a form of nuclear terrorism, whoever the perpetrator is. These are indiscriminate weapons. They're terrorist weapons. I did participate in a National Academy of Sciences study revisiting this threat just a year or two ago. And yes, I think people are still concerned. However, there are other types of terrorism that are clearly more likely. What happened, I had an expertise, and it made sense professionally for me to work on that topic, but I got intensely curious about the motivations of terrorists. And I wasn't trained to study that, but I couldn't resist studying that. So that I started working on actual terrorists as opposed to the weapons they might turn to.
That led to your second book, Terrorism in the Name of God. Received a lot of attention when it came out in 2003, deservedly so. It remains one of the most insightful and impactful and essential books in the field of terrorism studies. I always refer to your concept of sacred intoxication when I'm teaching classes about the religious-oriented terrorism. What advice would you give to a young scholar about going out and interviewing religious extremists today?
It was a very different era. I mean, students often ask me this, how can I do what you did? The interviews that you read about in that book, which, include members of Al-Qaeda who were in Pakistan, they called themselves Harkat al-Mujahideen. In Afghanistan, they were Al-Qaeda members. Before 9/11, it was possible. I mean, it was dangerous, and I'm really lucky that I survived. I also went and talked to one of the leaders of Hezbollah, one of the founders of Hamas. I I went all around the world talking to different types of terrorists. It's too dangerous to do today. I was That doesn't mean people don't do it. There are some people who do it. Vera Mironova has interviewed ISIS members, Nusra members. She's done really important work, but I think it was very dangerous what she did. I couldn't possibly recommend that a student of mine do that. I did exactly what Daniel Pearl did, and he was murdered. And so people said what he did was stupid and reckless. And
Well, we've all learned quite a bit from your efforts as well. So it's like I said, it's a monumental book in our field. I want to follow up on teaching for a moment, if we can.
Mhm.
You mentioned students. You've taught at a variety of institutions. You've taught at the Harvard Law School, Kennedy School, CIA University, and now you're teaching courses on history and psychology of terrorism at Boston University. How do you navigate some of the most challenging aspects of teaching about this topic, especially in today's political climate and information saturated environment?
You know, I I learn a lot from my students. One of the courses I taught at Boston University involves students going online and monitoring fringe sites. Uh, we got permission from Discord's lawyer for the students to do this. Having served in government, I didn't want to violate any terms of service or get my students in trouble in any way, even though obviously plenty of researchers do that. I just wasn't comfortable. So I got help from a lot of lawyers. Interestingly, I also had a psychologist on call because it's really traumatizing work. But we were watching the lead up to January 6th, and we could see what I would call incitement in that lead up. And so that would be one way I dealt with teaching in this environment. It's so much of where we learn about terrorist motivations is now online, or certainly what we learn about what they plan to do. Let me put it that way. I want to change what I just said. I don't know that we know about deep motivations, but we learn a lot about how terrorists are thinking by watching what they say online. And the problem is it's traumatizing. So I encourage my students never to do this more than 2 hours a day. I encourage them never to do it alone. I also, one thing I've really enjoyed recently is having my students participate in Invent to Prevent, which is a competition that was funded by the Department of Homeland Security for students to come up with ways to prevent terrorism. And, I'd never taught in this way before. They had the opportunity to earn some money, and they got so excited about what they were doing. And, I really had this feeling, this is really embarrassing to admit, but when I saw they were starting to ignore their other classes and get really obsessed with my class, I felt that it was a successful course. So that's something I hope will be offered again, because I just think it's a really good way to get students really engaged with learning about terrorism themselves, as opposed to my just standing up there and lecturing.
So a lot of active learning exercises.
Yeah, experiential learning. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you encountered difficulties with misinformation about terrorism with students coming to class thinking they know certain things about what terrorism is or isn't, or all that, and you have to sort of help them unlearn what they think they know?
Well, I think none of us fully understand terrorism. So I do try, if I think that they are wrong, I will certainly tell them that. But I also try to make clear that I have ideas that aren't necessarily universally accepted. So, in terms of ideology, there is a big debate in terrorism studies about the centrality of ideology. Is ideology the primary driver? And I think there's a spectrum. I think for some terrorists, ideology is a strong driver, but for a lot, it isn't. And I always tell students I'm probably at the ideology is less important end of that divide. But I want them to draw their own conclusions once they've, really engaged, really, as I like to say, taken a bath in the data.
Path and like that. So if the spectrum is here and ideology is kind of on this part of the spectrum, what do we find over here on this other end of the spectrum that's not really ideologically oriented?
I was looking for underlying motivations. And, for many terrorists, I think the ideology is almost a marketing ploy. It's a way to get people to join in the movement, but that the underlying motivations might be finding a community, finding a collective identity. Sometimes people are severely traumatized. They're trying to find a way to heal themselves. It's like, as one of my colleagues put it, Heidi Ellis, perverse post-traumatic growth to join a terrorist movement. There's I found many people are deeply humiliated. That can be a motivating force, either personally or politically. They're often also financial incentives in war zones. People can join terrorist groups as a way to make money, and they choose which group to join, not necessarily on the basis of ideology, but which group pays more or is more likely to provide essentially health insurance. If they die, will their family be taken care of? So all these things are much more pragmatic. The way I put it in my book, Terror in the Name of God, you can think of it as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that in war zones or conflict-prone areas, people are satisfying fundamental safety and security needs. And in peaceful democracies, we really see people doing this for significance or collective identity or transforming themselves. So that's how I came to see terrorism. And now, one of the questions you wanted me to address is how has terrorism changed over time? Now we see a lot of ideology hopping, people switching from one ideology to the next very rapidly. We see the so-called salad bar or compound ideology, where terrorists are combining hard left and hard right ideologies. We see people adopting an ideology at the very last minute. So it's hard to believe that they're really committed to that ideology. And we see nihilist violent extremists, to use the FBI's term, which are the so-called calm groups that really the ideology is violence itself. They and promoting chaos and taking down society without much thought about how to rebuild the society they think is too corrupt to fix.
So with these changes so what you've just described, these changes in terrorism over the last several years, are we seeing changes in the study of terrorism commensurate with those changes?
I think there are major differences in how we study terrorism since 9/11. What happened after 9/11, there was a recognition that the data were really, really bad. When I started studying terrorism, the data available to us were put out by the State Department. They were incident level data. So we could see from those data the target, the stated ideology. We could see the number of people killed or injured, and that's about it. Nobody was trying to actually understand what motivated terrorists. People were accepting that the ideology was motivating them, and that was the primary driver. And I didn't like what was available to me then, and I went out, as you pointed out, and did something kind of crazy. I went out and decided to talk to terrorists myself. But of course, there are problems with ethnographic interviews as well. The terrorists lie. I think I came up with a good way to get around that impulse to lie, which was to ask them questions where they didn't have quite as much of an incentive to deceive me, often about their personal motivations, their personal lives. After 9/11, a lot of money came into the field, and people were able to create much better databases. So now it's possible to do really rigorous studies of terrorism. At least until quite recently, it was possible to do that. So it was possible to create databases based on essentially an attempt to determine the psychology of terrorism, but with a large enough N that you could do econometric type analysis of the data. We had to rely on media reporting for that. But nonetheless, it's much better than what was available before there was a lot of money being poured into terrorism studies. It was possible, for example, to look at the extent to which military service might be correlated with greater violence among domestic terrorists. Questions like that, that we absolutely could not ask. And also the data available in regard to domestic terrorism around the globe were just terrible. And a lot of terrorism, of course, is domestic around the globe. Um, uh, One thing that we have been able to see is transnational links. I mean, today, it's this distinction we have always drawn between domestic and international terrorists doesn't mean that much, because terrorists are online, of course, and so they communicate across borders, but we can study that with the data available to us today. And one of the really tragic things about the cutoff of funding is that we won't be able to continue this kind of research, at least for the moment. I think it's been, for me, just amazing to watch the quality of work that has come out. It's become like a real discipline. And without funding, there's a lot of research that can't get done.
Yeah, a lot of projects have come to a screeching halt, for various reasons. These are obviously very difficult times for researchers of many different disciplines beyond
Yes.
terrorism studies. In terms of your own research, have you been affected personally, your research team?
One of the interesting things is that projects that are funded by states are still underway. So I do have a team with a biostatistician, Marcia Testa, looking at an effort to prevent school shooting. We were asked to evaluate this effort. And because it's funded by the state of Michigan, we're still able to help this psychiatrist who's trying to run a pilot to see if she can help kids who are at risk of violence. And so we're still able to do that. And I know there's research funded by other states that is still underway. And of course, there are foundations that are still funding research, but it just becomes a lot harder to do this really rigorous research.
Your own research, of course, has evolved in various ways beyond just terrorism. Not there's certainly other areas of interest as well. Do you find some intersections along the way in terms of your studies with terrorism and the psychology of terrorism and some of these other avenues of I should say human behavior? I guess the way to put it is the way that people act evil, or the way that the people behave in evil ways seems to like encompass a bunch of different types of behavior that you've kind of looked at throughout your career.
Yeah, I have an insatiable, seemingly insatiable drive to understand perpetrators of violence. And I have looked at a variety of perpetrators. And yes, I think that these underlying motivations that we spoke about do play a role in war crimes, those who perpetrate war crimes, and those who perpetrate non-ideological acts of violence. And I think it's a result of that understanding that public violence or targeted violence, which requires thinking in advance, planning in advance, there's many similarities. And one of the similarities, whether it's ideological or allegedly non-ideological, some of the ideological violence is less ideologically driven than we assume, and some of the supposedly non-ideological violence, school shootings, often contain an ideological component. The underlying motivations can be similar, but also leakage. We see because these are planned premeditated attacks, premeditated hate crimes, premeditated school shootings, they're always premeditated, terrorism, there is the possibility of intervening before the act of violence takes place. And so this term, targeted violence, has emerged to cover all these types of premeditated crimes.
And at the end of the day, I guess all this learning about what motivates people to get into or make these decisions to do these kinds of things can help us maybe push them to make other decisions not to do these kinds of things and get them out of terrorism, get them out of committing war crimes or other kinds of violence that they're choosing to engage in. Um,
Yeah, it's very, there's a big surge of interest in behavioral threat assessment and management, BTAM. It's going to be very hard for us to prove that it works, or because we will never know whether, the person makes a threat to attack. Well, I'm thinking of a particular case right now, a person who made a threat to attack a Black church. This was a white supremacist. There was an intervention. There was quite a bit of so-called leakage, and the person is fine now. The person is still monitored, but the person has a job, the person finished school, the person certainly did not attack that church. And it seemed like it was pretty imminent. Did that intervention stop that young person from attacking the church? We won't know, especially without asking the person. I would love to talk to the person. I'm trying in this case to talk to that person. But I'm not even sure I could say that we would be able to prove based on what the person said. There are just so many confounding variables. The person, for whatever reason, becomes less despairing, less hateful. Is it because of the therapy? Is it because he got a girlfriend? Is it what we just won't know exactly. Nonetheless, I know one of the questions you want to ask me is what should people be working on now? And I do think trying to figure out what works in behavioral threat assessment and management is a really important area for us to attempt to study. We won't be able to prove exactly what works, but right now the studies that have been done so far, it's usually the entity that is doing the BTAM, evaluating their own success. And I think we need third parties who are actually trying to figure out what might be most effective in BTAM.
Yeah, and like you've kind of hinted at, it's almost a case by case kind of individualized thing. This person may have had maybe 5% of their decision to move away from violence, being contributed to by the intervention, and then another person maybe 25%. How do you account for all these differences in terms of, the level of which this contributed to the decision or not? Yeah, that's difficult.
Yeah, but I think it's really important
Yeah.
because in the same way we rushed into war in Iraq and Afghanistan thinking that that was an appropriate response to Al-Qaeda, I think we might be rushing into behavioral threat assessment and management out of almost a sense of desperation.
Mm.
And so I think it's really important for us to do everything we can to try to understand what's most effective here. Even if, as I said, even if we can't prove, just do our best to do process evaluation, even if we can't do a complete impact evaluation.
And as we adapt our study of terrorism, as we've seen throughout history, terrorism also adapts. So what concerns you most about the future of terrorism?
What I'm really worried about now is that terrorists are becoming younger. And I'm most concerned about so-called calm groups, these nihilist groups that I mentioned earlier. These are young people who are persuading other young people to film themselves, harming themselves, harming their pets, humiliating sex acts. Some of it is just plain child sexual abuse material that sometimes gets sold. So it's a kind of intermingling of what's called CSAM, sexual abuse material, and terrorism. It comes out of, these are groups that are emerged out of the Order of Nine Angles, which is basically a British satanic cult that has now become an important player in the fascist resurgence around the globe. But these calm groups that involve children harming other children is the thing that really scares me the most. It's I've been pretty skeptical of ideology, but the terrorists also have changed and become less ideological over time. These groups are, they have a kind of patina sometimes of connection with neo-Nazism. They are accelerationists. They want to create chaos. They want to destroy society. But mainly they're just harming kids. And it's just a really terrible development. We need people who are willing to go online and try to penetrate these groups.
Mm.
And I'd like to see young people doing that, provided they have a lot of help making sure that they don't get severely traumatized.
Right, right. Training and monitoring, and yeah, same kind of problem we have with the monitoring that used to be done by the social media platforms. There was a lot of psychological issues with the individual who did that kind of work. We're wrapping up pretty close to the end of our time together, but is there anything else that you'd like to tell readers of terrorism and political violence about anything at all?
I guess I would say don't get discouraged. Their funding has been pulled back, but I believe that's temporary. And also, there are ways to study terrorism that are less expensive. Running enormous databases is very expensive, but there are other things that young people can do. And I do believe we will see funding coming back.
Well, I wanted to, on behalf of all our colleagues, thank you and congratulations, by the way, on all the fellowships you've been receiving over the last several years. I've noticed that that's quite phenomenal. All the awards and all the success you've had. We all wish you the best for continued success for many years to come. Thank you again for joining us for this conversation, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much.